Hi, everyone. Welcome to Office Hours. If you're watching on YouTube, you can find out more about what we do at officehours.global. First hour is general discussion about media and virtual production and anything else pretty much that you ask about. Second hour is usually something we're going to spend a little bit more time on today. We're going to talk about the Queen's coverage, the Queen's procession. And so if you've got questions about that or comments about that, go ahead and throw those into Makana. And I thought, the questions aren't that dense yet, so I thought we would just start chatting for a little bit before we jump into the questions. I was wondering how Grant's little trip to the U.S. has been going. Grant?
Yes, thank you. It's
You're in Nashville.
I'm in Nashville now, yeah.
Actually, have you had any barbecue yet?
Franklin, Tennessee. No barbecue.
It's really good. It's really good. Nashville's got good barbecue. Anyway, go ahead. How's the trip been so far?
It's been great. It was good. I got to drop in on Office Hours headquarters.
Yes.
And it was cool. I was just saying to everyone that I actually feel like Office Hours is more impressive looking at it virtually than it is just looking at a rack in a room.
There's a box.
Yeah, how big is the box?
It's about 55 inches high and about 30 inches deep and about 24 inches wide or whatever. That's Office Hours. Like it's the whole thing is all in this tiny little box.
But we got to shake hands with some people that I've met over 900 days ago, and so that was pretty special. That was cool. But it's funny, we just pick up from like it wasn't like it was weird to see each other in person. It was just here we are.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I did find it interesting when you visited that you don't know what that's going to be like, but the thing is, we know each other now. I mean, we've been hanging out together so much. Grant and I think we noticed that like 4 hours just went. Like just disappeared, because we were deep in conversation, having some ramen.
We had to go one by one through all of the people that are connected to Office Hours, and we had to talk about them all. So that's what I was.
Should our ears have been burning?
That's right, exactly.
Yeah, we did do that. So, but anyway, it's fun. So you're and who are you visiting in Nashville?
Well, my parents are here. My parents and my brother are here, and so both my brothers are pastors in large churches, and so it's actually kind of cool whenever I visit them because like lots of these big worship centers have incredible production.
Yeah.
And so I was just geeking out. There's some incredible things. And I tell you, I was talking to one of the guys that they have 6 Blackmagic cameras, a boom. They've got like a little jib and all the toys, right?
Right. And
what they had just started doing a month ago was recording the multi-view and of their switcher with the comms.
Yeah.
And I love this. And he said it's been a game changer for their team because when they do a little rehearsal of what's going to happen for the weekend.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
They record that. And so then they push that out to the whole team, whether they were able to make the rehearsal or not. And they know exactly what's going on for that particular weekend. And then, but the cool thing is when they do the weekend, they then send that multi-view to the whole team and they say, here you go, here's the whole show. And you can see it being switched. You can see everything going on and you can hear the comms. You hear the director calling all of the shots and making the changes. And I said that the next level on top of that would be to do director's comments on top of that, on top of the comms, because then you could say, hey, everyone, look at camera 1. That's the exact shots that we want. See how much headroom there is. Yep. See how much looking room there is. And then this is, because often with those camera angles, there's like 3-4 shots that you're just constantly rotating through, and so it's like, so this is the A shot that we want. This is the B shot. This is the C shot. Just sit there and watch that the whole time. And then if you're looking at, camera 2, then have a look at that and see this is the type of shot we want from there. And so it's incredible training that they can do. You just send that out and they have their whole streaming box a really nice streaming box set up where they send their links. They don't have to upload them to the cloud. They just send links out directly to the team and they're accessing it from the box on site. Yeah. So really, it's really cool talking to people that are working that stuff out.
Yeah, we one thing that I was talking to somebody that wants to, I think I might have mentioned this earlier in the week, but someone who wants to learn how to do switching, and just learn the ATEM, they've worked in the industry for a long time, but they just hadn't done a lot of hands-on. And I realized that once we started getting these loops running for, all the, the 12 people that we recorded, it's probably the best place to learn, because you can literally you have 12 inputs. And the only thing better than that we've never had enough of it where we owned everything. So we got to figure out how to do a show where we own all the footage. But the idea is where you can hear you get the raw feeds. Like if we put those loops up, I realized with Zoom ISO, we could put the loops up, and if you had a Zoom ISO output, you could have all 5 or 8 cameras that are there, and you hear the director from the comms, and then you just follow along. Okay, let's roll this. Let's go to camera 3, go camera 4. And you could learn how to do this before you ever, the first step would be to watch the show. The second step would be to listen to comms and watch the thing. The third would be watching what you're doing, what the church is doing in there. And then the next one would be to follow along. And then that gets you ready so that then you can practice all the lower thirds and all the other things like that. And then the next step would be to do it, to actually, then start doing smaller shows, and be a good way to ramp you up to a point where you knew how to do it. Anyway, it's kind of an interesting puzzle. I did use Zoom ISO for the first time in a real show yesterday. So, this is a real show. I'm sorry, I don't mean to say that, but like a show that got a lot of money rolling on it. What was interesting is that we've been, 090 has been a little slow because, we really wanted the audio returns, and so we've been a little slow about, not adding Zoom ISO to our productions, because we really have been doing individual computers for each one and screen scrapes and everything else. We found that there was this problem where if we had someone with low bandwidth, and they kept on popping out a full screen, because, in the vanilla version, because it has this kind of behavior when it's not getting enough bandwidth. And very quickly I was like, okay, we're going to move over. So we're just going to end. We're going to do it in 15 minutes, because it just wasn't, I was like, I don't want to see that on the screen. And so it was a big screen. A lot of people were watching. So I'm talking to Kevin Hansen he was down in LA, and he's like, okay, I need you to do this. And we started going through it all, and it just pops up full screen, works great. And so it was, I was like, I'm never going back. Like, we're going to have to figure out I'm just going to have to figure out return comms, because it's so much better. Like I didn't realize how much better it was going to be. We've been testing it, and we use it on this show, of course, but I was thinking about it when it's fully cooked or whatever, when 2.0 releases and everything else, but it's like night and day. So anyway, it's a good time. Well, anyway, Grant, good to have you here.
Yeah,
and,
thank you. It's good.
This
to
is
be
what
in the
happens.
Morning.
What?
Oh, it's good to be here in the morning.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not in the middle of the night. You're feeling great. So Grant, if you have Zoom questions or other production questions, Grant is more chipper than normal. So that's good. So anyway, we've got this is what happens. I've decided when we enter the show without a lot of questions, we chit chat for a little bit and get warmed up. All right, here we go. Let's go. Let's jump into the questions. Bill, what do we got?
Our first one comes from Douglas Carmichael this morning, and Douglas asks, has anyone had experience with Unity Connect? I've seen an example, and he's got a link there, of using it to remotely mix a TV show, and if it works well over the internet, it could be game-changing for some workflows.
Yeah, we use it a lot. So we don't use it as much for production. I know that Brian Maddox does, but what we use it for is to move comms back and forth. So we just used it on a show yesterday, and we'll use it again today. Basically what we do is we have Unity comms, and then on that server we have Unity Connect. And what we're able to do is tie in, a couple of the PLs from Unity comms into the Connect. And then what happens is on the remote side, they log in, and literally all we have to do is send them a profile that we know works, with what we're doing. They load the profile, and boom, they're connected to our Unity Connect properly, so that we're running comms in our office. And the reason that was really nice is we have a client that we've been using Unity comms with, and so that we have 30 people on it, and they're not used to using comms, but they've figured out how to use Unity comms, and they've got it all working. Asking them to now we need you to change servers. Now we need you to change servers back. Now that's not something that most people want to do. So for us, being able to quietly just say, just open up Unity comms on your phone, and it's going to work, and having it and then what we're doing is tying it into a free speak system on the other end. Now we had one free speak system yesterday, and within about 15 minutes, we had it connected to a completely different free speak system, 10 miles from the first one. and the folks that are on, I didn't have to ask, 50 people to change their comms, change their logins or anything else. It's just boom, it's done. And now they're able to just hit go. So that's how we use Unity Connect. It's not probably the most used version of that, but it's a really effective way to manage those things is with Unity Connect. And it just ties right into anybody's audio system. So they just have to figure out how they're going to, plummet into either and we have very, very little, we did a Unity Connect test where we were sending tracks from Belfast to Manila to San Rafael. And all of it was, with enough latency, all of it's very, very stable, very low loss. Or almost no loss in any packets. And so I will say that if you really listen to it, you can hear a little bit of quantization in it, when you stream it, but you really have to have it turned up to really, really hear that. So in normal workloads, you won't hear it. It's when you hear like tone or silence or something, you might hear like that kind of sound. It sounds just like that. Anyway, so that's the only thing that we hear every once in a while in really quiet areas. So anyway, it works really well. Next question.
Next one comes from Ray Franklin in Mount Dora, Florida. And Ray asks, notes, I lost a client when one of the PR team asked for a headset. I reluctantly gave her one without a working mic. How do you handle client requests for comms?
Go ahead, Grant.
Yeah, I guess it's an interesting one that not having the mic is less of an issue than then being able to hear comms and everyone on that loop being aware that there is a client on the end. Often we have, we try to avoid it, and we try to put them on a particular party line that is tied for that, for the clients, kind of a client group. If you have not set up for that and you end up with a party line that everyone's on, then we have code words for everyone to know that there is a client. Actually, I was able to listen to the comms at Disneyland for the Phantasmic show, which was awesome. I had a friend, stage manager, who calls the whole show, and so that was really fun to listen to. And so just sitting there on comms, and the thing they would say is, "There's gravy on the comms." There's gravy on the comms. And that just meant that it's got to be all clean and not normal, relaxed feel. It's an interesting thing now that we do things like Unity, and lots of us are doing really complex comm setups that are remote and tied into all the other systems. There's been a few times that I've tied them into Zoom calls, and so particular stakeholders in the event are able to hear different comms, and we're able to connect and they can hear some things. The interesting thing is I was caught out one time where the event had finished, and then I was closing down breakout rooms. It's a challenge to when you have breakout rooms and have different production things that are going on in each of those breakouts. And when I close the breakouts, of course, it closes everyone into the main session. And now you've got all of those things that are talking to each other, right? If you don't manage that correctly. And of course, what happened was I had a group that I was sure in Unity that there was only 3 of us on. And we started sort of dissecting the show and speaking frankly about it. And there was one of the clients that was listening to another channel in Zoom who closed in on the main channel, which then connected to another channel that we were in and were able to hear. Anyway, they jumped on with us, and they were like, "Oh, tell me more about your opinion about that." So anyway, it's yeah. So it's challenging to do comms. I totally believe it. Your event rises and falls on how well you have your comms set up. Yeah. But you just have to be really careful about where things are routed and who's listening, and then your behavior. I think generally, I try to have really good, clean show behavior always on comms. I think it's a a good principle to live by when you're on comms. Speak as if the client is listening, even if they're not, is kind of my thinking.
Yeah, and I have to admit that I we just had this yesterday, today and today. I try to include I used to we just would not want to put clients on comms, and we would do exactly what was mentioned here. But we've learned that it just really helps them to understand what we're working through to get things done. And we, hopefully have everything wrapped up. Now we do have a PL that's just us. like just push a button and we talk, there's some things that we need to talk about on our own. Just not mostly because some people, it's kind of like some people don't want to watch someone get cut open for a surgery. Sometimes the client doesn't need to hear all the problems that are happening because live is a crazy thing to work on. But I think that working through, that we had the client involved, and I was working through a remote participant in London and trying to, VIP and trying to work out her connection and, everything else. And I think that it was really good that the client was sitting in the background watching that process and hearing, what we were dealing with and what we were working through and how we were doing it, because they just understand. Sometimes I think that the other problem that clients have is they think everything's easy, everything's simple, everything's easy, everything. When they, you don't want to show them so much of the sausage making that it scares them off and they never want to do live again. But you do want to show them enough to understand that this is not just we're just going to have this person join, and then it'll be easy and it'll just work. That there's a lot of logistics and process and things that aren't going to go well. That ended up fine. Like when you see the show, it worked out fine, but there's a lot below the surface that it's good for them to see some of it, which we found over time. Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, sharing comms is sort of like having a client be able to read your mind. It's not always a pretty place to go visit. I always tell mostly freelancers that are on our comms when we do an event, speak like your mother's listening in, because
Yes.
it can be dangerous in terms of how you do. No, and like everybody's been saying, everybody has to be on their best behavior. And of course, that's sometimes funny when it comes from me. But I say, if the client's going to be listening, then you better act like it, because I want to do the next job with them.
There you go, David. Bill?
I read this literally and I thought, wow, this is a bad circumstance. It says I lost a client when one of the PR team asked for a headset and I gave her one without a working mic. And so if that's what caused you to lose the client, does that mean that she wanted to come on and say a bunch of stuff and wasn't able to and got really frustrated at that, and so fired the whole team?
Well, I mean, it's the thing is that it can really build up frustration because, it's not so much that it's what I think anyway. We have some clients that we definitely put into comms, and they're able to give us real-time things that they're sensitive to, and we're able to make error corrections during the show based on some feedback that they have. And if we can quietly kind of insert it into that system, it really alleviates. It gives them a sense of that they're really part of that team. And we've definitely been able to make those adjustments in real time, where if we couldn't hear them, we wouldn't be able to. And then they're just building up frustration.
For me, those first words, though, I lost a client when I thought, oh, this is a big deal. We have to pay attention to this. And I'm still unsure whether it was just the fact that client got on the headsets. Was it something someone said? The working mic, why was that important to that client? And can I figure out?
Well, that would cause a lot of clients be super frustrated. Like if they were put on comms and not able to, and they were like, regardless of whether that was going to be a distraction or not, giving someone, letting them hear and then not letting them talk when the big problem is that if you see something going wrong as a client, like something you really don't want to have happen, and now you can't say anything, it was worse than not having comms.
Yeah, I wonder if if the woman involved in PR took that as a slam. They kept me out, and so it was the emotional component of that. So the client recovery strategy would have been to sit down and go, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't understand this headset didn't have a microphone and we're so close to the show. That will never happen again. And maybe that could have been our client recovery strategy.
It could have been. It'd be hard. I think that's a hard one and it depends on whether the client's a new client or an old client. Generally what we're trying to do all the time is we're looking for everything that our client likes and doesn't like. And we're just slowly trying to shave all those things off. Like whatever those things are that they want, we try to figure out how do we solve that in a way that works for the production. And, we're just constantly evolving that. I mean, all the way down to the colors of the cables. And, we try to pay attention. Any kind of when we're in the same room, a lot of our producers will be sitting there literally watching the client's face, like, just looking over if there's like this concerned look on their face while we're doing something, or if there's a openness or whatever. We're paying attention to all of those things and trying to figure out how to shave those off. If we see them reaching over too often, a little too far to plug their stuff in, then the next time they come in, that plug will be closer. Like that's the kind of thing we want to keep on. And then what that happens when you get used to that little, what we call the cocoon, it means that when if you decide to use somebody else, the drop is pretty far. we're just continually raising up the experience to a point where if they went to anybody else who just didn't know all those little things, because it's not like we publish those, that it feels like you're running pretty rough, and then they come back and they're so much nicer afterwards. Javier.
Oh, yeah. What we do a lot when we are having clients on set, especially with doing advertisement, that we have like the agency and people from the brand, and they want to give feedback, but you can't have someone talking over the crew's ear, just like directing them. So another good thing we do when we have that situation is having someone with the client that gives them context. So it's like, this is happening because of this, and like having a separate comp channel, but also having someone there to help them, like to guide them, because even people that's been in a long time in the agencies don't know a lot of production things. So having someone to be the filter, this means this thing, and yes, I'm gonna tell them to do this other thing, sometimes help. And it could be a executive producer if it's like a higher client, and even it could be like a PA with great people skills if it's like a other kind of client.
And one of the things that is pretty useful about Unity is that a lot of times I keep both channels open. So both channels open. So while I'm giving direction that the client should hear, they're hearing it. They can still interact with me on the channel that I gave them, but they're not necessarily running over the production. And so for them, it's seamless. That they're hearing me. They're potentially hearing other folks, and we do that. And then if we need to have a conversation that's point to point because of something that needs to be done, we just turn that channel off, have a conversation, turn it back on again. But we want to have them generally hear almost everything that's going on. That's there, so that they again, to your point, they have context, but a lot of times their talkback is so they're hearing a lot of things. Their talkback though is only to a certain number of people, so that they don't, and it's more so they don't, because they don't understand what the machinery is, they're not accidentally stepping over it while we're calling cameras or something like that. Next question.
Next one comes from TJ Asher in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Ask a stupid question day, huh? Okay, I'll bite. How do I remove the Neutrik end of my XLR cable to swap it out for a new right angle one?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Removing is not a problem. If you've got your Neutrik here, hello, there it is. It's a pretty easy matter just to unscrew it and to remove the end here. It's pretty
Look
easy
at that
to do.
little close up.
I got a close-up.
I didn't see that close-up.
And then you just push it, and there it is. There's the pieces. But here's the rub. You're going to have to unsolder some of this in order to get this wire through the strain relief that'll inevitably be on the right angle piece. So that's the issue. You're going to have to get the soldering iron out, or you can just avoid all this unscrewing of cables and just snip it with a pair of dikes.
That's what I was going to say. I was like, I would never unsolder anything. Just go ahead, Javier.
Yeah, I was going to add that, taking it out is like the easy part. And you also have to put the other connector. So you have to be, the right angle connectors, you have to be very careful, like where do you put you have to see the wiring diagram. It tends to always be the same. Just like be sure that you're taking the hot one and the negative one where it has to be. So taking it apart is half of the problem, and putting it together is the other half of the solution.
Yeah, and for me, when I replace connectors, I generally just cut them short. I just cut short of them. I might unsolder it later so I can use it again if I want to, but that usually doesn't happen either. I don't like to reheat things. I mean, when I used to work in electronics, I used to wire, DIN 25s and other things like that. And if we didn't get it right the first time, we just threw it away because we didn't want to keep on putting stress on the system with heat. And so I have a tendency to just cut them, restrip it, and start from scratch. If I'm going to put a new connector on and I want it to be in its best quality, I'm going to do it once and I'm going to do it perfectly, or I'm going to do it again, like with something new. Like it's, this is your entire signal flow. So you just want to be super particular about it to make sure that you're getting the best connection. Go ahead, Bill.
And I have found that if you have to disassemble and reassemble something for the first time and you've never gone through that particular experience before, your phone camera is your best friend. I can't tell you how many times I've taken apart something and I had to change a battery on a laptop. And just taking pictures of the disassembly process meant that I always could go back and know for sure at what state was this before I took it off, which wires went where, which screws came out of where. And I sometimes have 50, 60 photos of a disassembly process, but boy, it makes it easier to get it back right.
And I will say that if you haven't done a lot of soldering, TJ I think has, but if you haven't done a lot of soldering in the past for connectors and you want to start to get into it, the best thing to do is to buy just some raw cable, maybe 100 feet of raw XLR cable. You can get a whole bunch of cheap connectors on Amazon in a bag of 50 or whatever, and just terminate them all. Like just terminate 50 of them. And watch video. Here's the key: is watch videos very carefully. There's a great one from the early '80s that just really nails it. That I've talked about in the past. I thought it was the '50s, but it turns out it was the '80s. Just really nails exactly how you should do that. If you can find someone that's going to give you feedback, get feedback. But watch those videos. Do a couple. Watch the videos. Do a couple. Watch the videos, and really make sure that you're. I mean, if signal, this is really your. This is all your signal flows go through these. So if you start building cables, you just want to work on making sure that you're really precise about it. Otherwise, you could end up with a lot of issues. Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, a couple of tricks to watch out for is don't use too much heat because it will melt the connector. Be sparing with the solder and make it happen. You don't use a lot of solder. You don't want a blob of solder. You just want enough there to coat everything.
Javier.
And Mickey on the chat is telling that you can actually just replace the 90 degrees part of the Neotric connector. Mitch says no. So I just wanted to put it into a conversation that maybe like soldering is hard for a lot of people, for me specifically. So if you can only change it, maybe that will work. So I just want to letting know that Mickey is saying it, that maybe we can try it.
Yeah. Next question.
Next one comes to us from John Wallace in Pontiac, Michigan. And John asks, what is the technology that brings us the live weatherman spots from the center of the storms?
Go ahead, Preto.
I just asked this question to one of our esteemed panelists that's in the 3D industry. I'd rather not say his name, but he said that the Weather Channel just recently switched over to zero density, and it's based on Unreal Engine is what it's based on. So they're using zero density. I put the link in the chat.
And go ahead, Mitchell.
It need to be a little bit like a cartoon animated show. I've for some reason, I think Preto and I were watching it online yesterday, and it was like, and Preto says, well, there goes the Weather Channel again, and I looked over and they had this, water raising and around the guy. And
there's only so many things you can do with a map. I mean, like you got to do something.
I guess, but it's just strange to see all this animation happening.
Go ahead, Grant.
I'm just glad that it's progressing, this kind of thing. Hopefully gone are the days of reporters standing out in the rain screaming at us because, like you can't hear them and there's wind and they're blowing around. Like we don't know what weather is. We don't know what rain is or windy. It's really windy here. You can see I'm blowing around.
That's how you get an Emmy, though.
Well, yeah, exactly.
But I think about it.
I would rather, I want to see live pictures, right? I want to see, and so I'd rather have a bunch of live cameras around that are showing me good views of that rather than some virtual thing, rather than them standing out in it.
Yeah.
This is just really good coverage of actual footage of what's going on right now.
I have a friend whose family is in Tampa right now, and it's coming in, and they've all left, but they still have and they have a security camera there. And I was like, you should stream that. And I was like, before I left, I would have absolutely put up some high-res cameras, stuck it out the window, like spent a lot of time rigging it all up. I was like, if I'm going to lose this house, I'm going to at least get some footage out of it. And so I'd be streaming it to a remote server. And because, if you just left that streaming, people would turn that on. I think you're absolutely right. You can put a lot of crazy graphics in and put people on, but what people want to see is what's actually happening there. And having, 10 or I think that if someone went into a space like this, and we're going to, with the trajectory of things going on, we'll get more opportunities to do this. Putting 10 or 15 cameras on a website that you can just switch to see what's happening. Because admittedly, a lot of people are also just worried about their family and worried about people there. and just wanting to see what's going on. And they don't really want the story as much as they just want to just see the camera. So you're absolutely right, I think.
Well, even Ring doorbells, right? Like as in
right.
just having a place where people can say, I'm happy for people to look at my doorbell, you know, feed, and you see a map and you can go around and look out the front door of everyone's places. You could see whether things are blowing down the road or not. Like it would be really handy.
Yeah, if I lived in Hurricane Alley, I would definitely be building systems that I could put, like 2 or 3 cameras that I could put in different places to capture that. Go ahead, Bill.
To support that point, they had a shot yesterday of the multicolored pylon that's at the end of Key West down there, right? The end of land for the U.S. Mm-hmm. And it's a very specific thing. And there were all these yahoos out there, and I'm sorry to use the term, but I think they were crazy. The storm was brewing. People were telling you to get out of there. And there were all these people taking selfies and playing around with it. And the water was a little bit roiling, but probably safe at that moment. But they cut back to that same shot an hour later. And oh my gosh, that whole thing, you could still see it out there, but it was getting just crushed by these huge storm surge waves. And there was nothing that was more visceral about this is why you want to pay attention to these people. At first you thought I could stand there next to those people. And the next one you went, I would be dead right now if I kept doing that.
Yeah. For as far as the graphics go, I think that what I love about what the Weather Channel is doing is they're spending a lot of money and building technologies that we can use for other things. So, I think that the real blessing of Hollywood and of news and everything else is that a lot of this would be really useful for education and all kinds of other things. And it would be great if we could, a lot of this would be really useful. And the main thing is that they're paying for us to use it later for something else. Every time I look at something where someone's wasting money on something that's not really necessary, I'm like, well, that we'll be able to use that for something else down the road. Next question.
Chris Widener in Lafayette, Indiana says, if you were trying to do location-based digital marketing for commuters, besides digital billboards, what would you focus on? The radio/print market is dying or dead in Indiana, and you can't exactly scan a QR code while you're driving.
Can't you? Go ahead, Grant.
This is really interesting because it's really the state of media in general. And I think about my listening, what I listen to when I'm driving habits has totally changed, of course, over the years. It used to be radio and things, and quickly it moved to listening to podcasts or audio books or things as I'm going. I think the key is that there needs to be a variation of length of content. And I think what we're seeing now is the two extremes are really popular. The ultra edited, very short 1-minute TikTok style videos, clearly very popular. And then the long form, natural conversation, Rogan style 3-hour conversations are clearly highly popular. And people thought that was crazy that you would have an episode of something that would go for 3 hours. But I regularly listen to Rogan episodes that go that long because there's a flow that happens across the conversation that's really interesting. Spotify, I don't know how Spotify have done this. It's annoying that you pay for Spotify, but then you still get ads when you're listening to podcasts. That's annoying. So those ads that drop in, I don't love that type of thing. Trying to sound like they're selling it. The way that Leo does it is completely different in that whether he does or not, he sounds like he truly believes in the products that he's selling. I don't think that they take on sponsors that they don't believe in, and so that's a real key is the way that that's spoken about, and then. The second part of that is that there's an easy way when you're not driving and you want to access that link, that there's a really easy way to go and find that. So I've heard about a product I'm interested in, and now I want to follow up. Maybe something that you can drill down. It's kind of show notes and things like that. But then the localization, I know you're saying that as well. And I think that's an interesting thing to explore. But it definitely is relationship based. Even that's changing a little bit in this social TikTok really changed that to algorithm-based content versus social sphere content. And I think it's taken off because of that. Our social spheres were so limited that, yes, I say I like all these friends and I'm waiting for them to share something, versus these are the things that I'm interested in, and it's now going to show me far more interesting information. So I'm interested where that goes as far as marketing, localized marketing. It's a really fascinating space. But the idea of thinking about what someone's doing when they're sitting behind a wheel where they shouldn't be touching their phone. And so what I do is I sit down and how long is my trip going to be? It's a 30-minute trip. Okay, I want a 30-minute episode, or at least a 30-minute episode. I can't be listening to a 5-minute and then need to change my phone. And so it's really, really interesting creating those different options of duration as well.
Yeah. Mitchell?
To reach people in a car, commuting, the traditional methods still work best. Billboards and radio. You reach radio listeners in a region that's hyper-localized.
I find
and you don't really have that ability to do that in traditional media because it's too much of a broad reach in terms of your marketing extent.
I find radio to be fascinating. I mean, I know we have people here who own radio stations, so what I'm about to say is probably not the best thing. But I just don't. I never turn my radio on, like ever. Like I never, like it's the ads, like it's the interruptions that I can't skip. And I will admit that I'm so ad free now that it is very hard for me to listen or watch an ad. And I think that's a real challenge. Like I was talking to somebody about, like I never go to a website and watch their videos ever because I have premium on YouTube, so I don't see any ads on YouTube. And I'll go find, if I see that there's a video on, time.com or newsweek.com or whatever, I immediately go to YouTube and search for that thing and try to watch it on YouTube because I don't have any ads. Otherwise, I'm stuck with this 30-second thing that I don't want to see before the
You're
thing.
not the typical consumer.
I don't know.
A little bit different. No, I think that there's a vast majority of people listen to traditional radio, as it were.
I don't think anymore. I think a vast majority of people over 50, maybe, and I'm over 50. But I think a vast majority of people over 50 might do that. But I think under 50, I don't know anybody that listens to radio. Like I just don't. Like it's not a. And I think that that's a challenge for traditional things. Now, I think billboards are interesting. In the county that I live in Marin County, it's illegal. there's no, I realized, I was like, why don't I was trying to think of billboards. It's like, I can't think of any billboards. I was like, oh, right, we're not allowed to have them. So it's a very odd thing when I see billboards because it's just like, wow, look at that big picture that's sitting by the road because we almost never see them here. Go ahead, Bill.
I think your reports of radio's death are greatly exaggerated.
I didn't say there's radio's death. I just said I don't listen to it very much. I didn't say that I think that radio still has I'm still trying to figure out how to get, and I think in other parts of the world, I think radio is still a big deal because they don't have bandwidth. But I think that when you start having bandwidth on your phone and you're not paying for every bit, you start listening, your behaviors, they don't change overnight, but your behaviors start to move towards things that are a little bit more fluid and flexible. Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
So to me, Grant's point is really interesting. And the thing that I miss from those long talking shows is there's no serialization of the narrative thread. I mean, you come back to the same people talking about the same kinds of subjects, and there's variation in there, and I get that. What's really satisfying to me has been my habit of doing audio from Audible and getting some sort of novelization of something so that I can control it just like I could control time-shifted content with a VCR. I can start the story, I can go away and do something else, I can come back, find exactly the place I was on, get the next part of the story, and I get an overall cohesive view of this piece of content, even if I have to chop it up to my will. That's very much what time shifting used to do. And I find that to be even more compelling than just going into somebody else's stream and back out of it.
Well, and I think that to your point, I mean, one of the things that NPR for a long time, they from the 2000 on, they had a playlist function. It was like in Flash on the website or whatever. And that's how I got used to reordering my playlists so that I could just listen to what I wanted to listen to in the order that I wanted. Because usually what would happen is I'm going to throw everything else. I'm going to throw everything I didn't get to in NPR out every day. Like, cause it's just, otherwise it builds up. So I'm going to put all the stories in the order that I think is the most important, and then I'm just going to listen to them, and I'm going to cut out all that stuff in the bottom of the hour because it's worthless. And so that made it much more listenable. And I literally couldn't. I think this is to get to Mitchell's point. I could not go back to NPR on the radio, like it was, or listen to their raw feed anymore, because I was so used to customizing my experience to it. I couldn't come back because it was just super frustrating for me. Like I was just like, oh my gosh, now I'm going to have to listen to this clip. I'm going to have to listen to this segment for the next 4 minutes. I just need to go somewhere else. And so I think it's interesting to get back to Chris's question. I think the big thing is that you do want to think about the funnel. Like a lot of times we call it the funnel, which is how do we get to you first? And then how do we get the people that are interested to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing? And that number of people, if you think about it, that number of people is going to start really big, but it's only going to end up being some small percentage down at the bottom of that funnel. But how do you keep moving them down that funnel into, some people call it a sales funnel, some people call it a marketing funnel, but how do we get them to a place where we're going to give them a call to action? Oftentimes you don't want the call to action to be in the billboard or in the other things. You want to get them somewhere where there's something that they can have. So a lot of times you want to be really clear and really basic on the billboard. The other thing to look at from a marketing perspective is really, we can all talk about how we feel about Facebook, but Facebook is really powerful when it comes to location marketing, because you can say, I only want people in this region that are interested in this thing. And it's super effective for now. I don't know how long it will be, but it is super effective. So we can talk about whether we approve of Facebook or not, but I can tell you ad campaigns with Facebook are super effective at finding people that are in the digital world. Those other things are going to be, one thing that we also do a lot is we engage with local news. One thing I was just having a discussion with people about this. To Mitch's point, there's a bunch of people that are still in a pretty analog world. And they're used to, the traditional radio and so on and so forth. You can buy ads, and that can be useful, but you can also work with content marketing. So providing them things that are easy for them to put on the air. You'll find that a lot of news folks don't have a huge budget, and they have a large need to fill something every day. And if you give them things that are easy for them to cover, sometimes they'll cover those things because, so that comes down to just PR of releasing things. But don't release press releases that are, you write them. What you want is a journalist writing the press releases. You want to write them like a story. Like I could cut and paste. If you write press releases in a way that I could cut and paste this press release into a newspaper, man, does it just happen? If you write it in the way that you want to say everything you want to say, it doesn't go anywhere because it doesn't help them. They now have to rewrite it. They're in a rush. They're just trying to fill pages. So they can sell ads. And so you want to be really careful about really looking at how do you serve your publications that are in your region and your radio stations and TV stations. How do you serve them with the content that they need in the most digestible form that they can have? And there's huge agencies that do this really, really well. You don't see very much of it. You don't hear it because they don't talk about it a lot. But there's government organizations that do this. There's all kinds of things where they're pushing out tons and tons of content that you could literally just cut and paste into a show or into whatever, and people use it all the time because they just don't have enough content to sell against the ads. Next question.
Next question from Brandon Buttram in Indianapolis in the USA. Have you ever asked a stupid question to a coworker, client, or venue operator only to realize that it was not a stupid question after all?
Okay, Grant?
This is good, and it probably related to TJ's question before. I've heard a couple of different quotes on this that are really helpful. One is that we've often heard there's no such thing as a stupid question, but the extra part to that is only stupid answers. And then I've heard that Carl Sagan said that there are naive questions, there's tedious questions, ill-phrased questions put after inadequate self-criticism. But every question is a cry to understand the world. There is no such thing as a dumb question. And I think the worst thing that you can do is preface your question with saying, this is a stupid question, because it possibly isn't. And I think in TJ, in your example, you could have totally, we spoke for how long? 5 minutes about changing a connector. It's a valid question. How do you change a connector? How do you change it to a right angle? That's not at all a stupid question. And so that was a good case in point that you don't need to preface your questions with that. But take your time. And I like the idea that we're just trying to understand our world. And office hours would not exist if it wasn't for
Keep on asking those questions.
keep on
Don't
asking
stop.
questions. But it wouldn't exist if we said no stupid questions. There would be someone that would be trying to judge those as to whether they're stupid questions or not.
Right.
But actually, it's because we are a curious bunch of people that we all have questions. All the panelists all have questions. All of our producers have questions, and that's what keeps us interested in getting up every morning. Is I wonder what questions and answers we'll mess around with today.
Go ahead, Bill.
Also understand that your audience is going to bring varying levels of understanding, familiarity, and everything else with the questions asked. So what is a bad question for me in a subject that I've studied over and over and over again is definitely not a bad question for somebody who's just getting into that part of trying to understand that. So the simplest questions to bring along people who don't have as much experience into understanding are every bit as valuable as the high-end question where you're exploring new thinking, in my mind.
You go ahead, Mitchell.
I don't think there are stupid questions. I think there are stupid answers sometimes.
Yeah, and the main thing is that I think that the structure of it is to have it not sound stupid, is to a lot of times I will do some research before I ask. If there's a question like, should I know this or not? There's a little bit of Googling that goes on. There's a little bit of looking around. There's, and who you ask the question to is important. Like I might not ask the person that can absolutely answer it, but it'd be I kick it around a little bit if I'm not sure of something. If I don't know something, I will say people do make decisions about folks based on the questions. Like if someone asks me, what is an XLR? I may decide that they're probably not the right person for my audio engineer. As an audio engineer, I'd be like, I don't know. I don't think you're going to fit in. So those are the kind of, you do those questions. People are going to make decisions about. Like there aren't any stupid questions, but there are questions that can put you in a little box. So in production, and so you do want to think about those things. And I'm usually careful about who I ask the question to, but I often ask a lot of them. Go ahead, Grant.
I think for TJ's question, what is the best sequence for changing the XLR adapter to a right? And now it's like, I know how to do it. Of course I know how to do it. But what's the best sequence for doing it?
I was just watching Fletch last night. We were watching it's all about ball bearings. Anyway, next question.
Next one from Paul Shadwell in Turbenthal, Switzerland. I'm putting together a Zoom ISO kit and was wondering if there is a software solution to the Blackmagic Decklink cards. If I need to go Decklink cards, which one should I go for?
Yeah, go ahead, Grant.
I'm not quite understanding the question. I'm just trying to work out is there a software solution to bypass having Decklink cards? So Decklink cards will need the Blackmagic drivers to be installed, the video tools or whatever that's called, and then that will enable it. And that's the beauty of Zoom ISO version 2 now, is that it's talking directly to that. It's going directly from Zoom, from the client, and going directly out to the Decklink cards. The other thing that Zoom ISO does is NDI, and so we've talked about that, being able to now put that on the network and receive that, not just the network, but also on the local computer, and being able to open up other NDI software and receive that. There's also things like Siphon, which is an even more powerful set of software that can enable other applications to receive that live feed, particularly on the device. So from a software solution, I'm not quite sure where that was going, but hopefully that kind of answers some of what Zoom ISO can do.
Yeah, I'm trying to build as many different versions of Zoom ISO right now just to figure things out and try to bang on things. And so for me, I'm using Siphon to get to Memo Live, and I'm going to be probably testing that with Ecamm as well. As far as, same Mac has the Zoom ISO on it and just passing it somewhere else on the Mac. That's where Siphon will work well. I'm also putting a vMix system in where I'm going to have a PC with vMix, and so that I can use NDI across the network to get to those. And so that's going to be my little lab as far as that goes, as far as moving those in. And then finally using the Blackmagic, which I'm now putting out into a 20 by 20 router that's going to be tied into a SDI switcher. And the thing is that what I'm excited about is not just that I have I'm not just excited about the fact that I can switch all those things with Zoom ISO. It's that I have all those ISOs like this like I'm going to have the second hour. We have the, you know, the little card that we have here I'm going to put that on its own monitor, and I'm going to take the WLM meters and put that on its own monitor. Like I just go grab all the things. And I realized that we could put all kinds of services for our panelists up there. Like there could be a whole bunch of new windows that have data and other things that we want. Next question, all these other things could be all up there. And they're just all, you know, in different, if we choose to, we can just put them all on different little monitors and so on and so forth. So I'm going to be doing a lot of experimentation like with that. It should be interesting. Next question.
Vincent Alvarez from Billingham, Washington. Today, I went to finally purchase an IFB that was recommended months ago. It was beige, comes in pieces, coiled cable that snaps together and clips on a shirt collar. Is there a brand name I should look for? Is there one with 2 ears at the same time?
Usually the IFBs are not. They're only 1 ear. I think that Audio Implements is the one that in the United States is what everybody uses. that's the, so if you're going to get one that you want to work with everybody else's ecosystem, then you just go to Audio Implements and get those. Usually what we do, we don't get the coil. The coiled cables get tangled up and they get kinked. So we use regular ones, but our kit has one of the receivers. I think it's the 15 ohm receiver. And then we have, it'll have a 2-prong, and we have one TS and one TRS because some IFB receivers will only do TS or TRS. And so we have those usually just sitting in there. Then we have the coil, and usually in our kit, we'll have a coil to the left, a coil to the right, so that you can plug them all. You decide which way you're going to plug them in. And then the other side of that receiver, which will just be 2 pieces there. And so and a lot of times broadcasters, if you're a host, people usually have their own earpieces. And so if it's a standard, what we call a standard telex connection. So they'll have their own and they'll just hang back and you just put that last little cable on. Go ahead, Grant.
Yeah, there was one recommended years ago was the Otto, OTTO. You can get that from B&H and that's just a single one and it's the tube and it's really neat. The thing that I've found is that depending on how long you're doing that for, it's not just the comfort level, but it's also just the sound. Like if that's got to go through some tube, it's going to sound like that sound is going through a piece of tube, right? It's audible, it's fine. But what I liked is moving to like these are Shure in-ears, like they're designed for music, and so as I'm hearing, I get the full experience of Alex's voice when I'm listening to it. It's
amazing
tones. It just feels like I'm right there. But honestly, though, if you're sitting for hours, like we do on these things, you want the sound to be good. And so I prefer to have something that's full range, really high quality sound, and they've got a nice comfort that you can sit for hours and hours. Yeah,
and I also moved away from IFBs to the ones that I get are these Linsol KZ-ZS10s Pros, or I think the Pros. Let me see, maybe not the Pros. The Pro ones, they're about $49. The ones that I'm wearing right now. And they're both ears. It took me a little while because there was so much more information that I was getting from them than my IFB, because before that I was using an Audio Implements. And there was so much more information that I was getting about my voice and about the show that it was almost overwhelming. It was distracting. So I had to get used to it. But they are 2-ear. I will say that if you use them every day, all day, I'm on probably 4 hours, 5 hours a day on them, that the little filters on them eventually fall apart. Like these are $49. And if you use them every day, after about 4 or 5 months, they seem to kind of start to feel the wear and tear of going in and out of your ears all the time. So I would say that the interesting thing is I went and tried to buy the more expensive version of these, the Pros, I think, and they not as comfortable. They're a little bit bigger or something, and I just couldn't wear them. So I do wear them when they do sound a little bit better, but I couldn't wear them all the time. So the cheaper ones actually turned out to be a better solution for me than the ones that I had bought before that. So that's just something to think about. But they are really good. Again, the only problem with the autos is we bought lots and lots of them. I probably bought hundreds of them. The last 2 years, they seem to not have the same power. So if you buy them now, we have a lot more complaints about I can't hear the show. With a kind of consumer connection, which we didn't have that issue in the past, and they have changed a little bit in the form factor, and I think that they might have changed something in their the transmission system. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael asks, the TD Garden Arena in Boston touted their upgrade to a 4K video board. When you're not in a properly built screening room or a small space like a home living room, isn't 4K over?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Douglas, I don't think 4K is overkill. 8K would be overkill.
All right, go ahead, Bill.
Well, sometimes you want what's called a 1-to-1 pixel ratio, which means that if you're putting something on a screen and it's important to you, and you're using a 4K source, you want every pixel of that source mapped to a pixel on the display so that you know for sure that any anomaly you see, a moire or something like that, is actually there and not an artifact of some scaling or something like that. So I can see them wanting to synchronize their production pipeline and their display pipeline so that it's all the same for those kind of technical reasons.
Yeah, and the other thing to remember is it depends on how big the monitor is. Like the resolution in the monitor. I mean, I've worked on some monitors that are 16,000 wide. Like they're way bigger pixels because it's a really giant monitor. Some of them might be 100,000 pixels wide. It just depends on how big. Is it 20 feet wide or is it 10 feet wide? It's how close those pixels are and how close they are to what we're always resolving towards is what Apple calls, the retina display. Like, do we get to a point where we don't see any pixels? And so when you have a really, really large monitor, that higher resolution will make it just feel more like a piece of paper, more real. And you'll stop resolving on really where you see the resolution is when you see curves on text or curves on numbers. And as you increase that resolution, you're going to see nice smooth curves as opposed to the jaggy aliasing that we would normally see. And I measure that all the time. Anytime I see graphics, I immediately look at it on a big wall. I immediately look at the edges. I look at the curved edges, and that tells me how high resolution the wall is. So it's like, and I definitely respect really, really high resolution walls. I feel like it's great when it just feels like you're looking at. I think it makes it more physical when it's a higher resolution. Go ahead, Mitchell.
I have a Sony OLED TV that has what they call the X1 processor in it. And it's kind of controversial, but what it does is it's constantly adjusting pieces of the image to meet a database that it keeps in its little brain to adjust the resolution on a face or the curves on something that the normally. So it's really hard to tell these days when you see something that's a 2K that's been up-res to 4K. It looks pretty darn good in either case. And when you're sitting 15 feet back with a 55 or 65-inch screen, like Alex says, the pitch on the pixels tends to disappear.
Yeah, and if you're at an arena, a lot of times 4K wouldn't even be enough for a lot of things. Like it would be, you'd want a lot more for a 4K, as far as resolution goes. Next question.
Chris Widener in Lafayette, Indiana. Up next, a friend who sells for a station shared, and he's got a socio.com link there, statistics for why podcasting is a, quote, waste of time and money. This disagrees with a lot of polls and stats I've seen. Ammo for a rebuttal other than a shoe?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
I don't want to get sucked into this argument, but being a radio person, I think it's okay. It's important to point out some things that radio does very well, and it when you stack it up against podcasting or other digital medias like social media, it doesn't quite match up. But that's not where it's doing its best work. It's doing its best work like it was in the beginning, and that is when people are commuting to and from work, and when they're sitting in their office where they can have a radio in the background, but they can't have a stream running. Mm-hmm. So radio still has its place. It just needs to remember where its place is.
Go ahead, Bill.
I read through the piece after I saw this when I first came in this morning, and I thought it felt like it was something from a PR company hired by radio to kind of make the best possible case. And there's nothing wrong with that. And there is a case to be made for radio still. A large number of people, particularly in rural areas, depend on broadcast radio, and we hope that it remains robust. But it's unfortunately not the economic powerhouse that it used to be. And I note that from going to NAB for decades and watching the radio section first grow and become dominant and then get smaller and smaller and smaller over time, to the point where the last NAB I went to before the pandemic, radio was with a fraction of the least attended hall. That doesn't mean there's still not viability to it, but it's not the juggernaut that it used to be. And they're trying to deal with that.
Yeah, I think that, when you look at podcasting, the big thing is when we say it's a waste of money, it just costs so little. So it costs so little to podcast. If you want to be on radio, you have to have a license and you have to have a transmitter and you have to have all these other things. So it's a big gate to who can do this. When it comes to podcasting, you need a good mic, and maybe a couple good mics to do this. And now with things like, again, what we're doing right now, like this Friday, we'll be recording, the podcast with Zoom ISO. You can be starting to grab all of those, all those feeds separately and pull them in. So I think that it's never been so inexpensive to do podcasting. So it's hard to say what the ROI is compared to that. What it does take non-traditionally, if you don't have a lot of money, is stick-to-itiveness. We were trading notes with a pretty large YouTuber. He pointed out that he has released a video every week without fail for 9 years. And I was like, wow, and Marquez Brownlee talked about this in the past of like, just know that your first 100 won't work, and that you'll figure it out over time. And I think that is a really good thing for us to keep in mind, is that podcasting and social and everything else is, that is it takes time to build that audience, and it takes time to work through those, especially if you haven't done radio, because you don't, there are some structures there that work. So I think that it's a great way to build again, also a very focused audience, people who are going to listen all the time. And we're experimenting a lot with that right now. With Michael Krasny, who comes from radio. We're rebuilding the radio idea online. We're going to see how that goes. Go ahead, Grant.
There's lots to this, because we've got to separate out the content from the medium or the delivery method, right? Because it's almost like saying that movies are dead because DVDs are dead. Well, no, they're not. They've just moved to a different medium, and there's a different way of delivery method that's been great. And so the type of content that radio has, where it is more of a linear content, you can find that online. You can watch twit.tv and just have it on, turn it on, and it'll just play a whole bunch of content. So there's ways of doing that. But specifically to this article, the first point was radio is listened to weekly by more than 3 billion people around the world. Well, let's also remember that there are 3 billion people in the world that do not have access to the internet. And so to say that 3 billion are listening to radio doesn't really mean much around the world, because they may have no access to anything else.
Right.
And then it says the typical listener listens to an hour and 40 minutes a day. The typical radio listener, as Alex was saying, is likely to be a boomer or above, right? And so who is your target market? Who has the most disposable income? Chances are it's not the retirees that are listening to radio. And so for Chris, as you're tackling this, the reach that radio has, that's a weird term to use. Reach is something that we use on Facebook to try to justify all these numbers. But reach means that I have a radio in the car, which means I could turn it on. Right. That doesn't mean that I'm listening to it.
I mean, the most useful part of the LCD on my car, on one of my cars at least, is that the suction cup that holds my iPad just pops right onto it really, really well. And then I just, it just sits behind it. And I have a CD player in my older car, and it's really good because you can put a little thing that you can put a magnet into. You can put it in and you open it up a little bit, and it just attaches itself to the CD thing, and then you have a real device. And so anyway, it's an interesting puzzle, I think. And we're going to go over a little over, by the way, because we don't have a ton of questions in Queens and for the Queen's funeral, and we have. So if you put more questions about the Queen's funeral, we'll jump faster. But right now we've got a couple more questions on the stack. Just letting you all know.
If I can just add, Alex, so this other point was that 41%. Radio garners more listening time from US adults than any other source. So at 41% of what people listen to is radio. What a weird way of saying that, because actually what you should be saying is 59%
don't listen to radio.
Don't listen to radio. Exactly. Like that's the larger number.
Yeah. And again, I think that I don't think this is necessarily saying that radio is not a good business. There's good business. You can make a good business out of many, many things, but it's going to continue to be more of a niche. I do think that there is something that we're moving towards. What we want to move towards in office hours over time is the idea that you could just turn it on and listen to it all the time. Like it's just a stream. And if you could always, just turn something on and listen to it. So I think that there's something about that. Like I just want something going on in the background and I can, just absorb what's happening. I think radio provides that. I think the hard part is if you have any show, the idea that I have to show up at 10 o'clock in the morning to listen to a show or 12 o'clock in the afternoon, it's a little bit more. And I think that we really saw that, I not grew up, but I spent years listening to Michael Krasny on air, and it's all questions from San Francisco because that's where everyone was listening. And now it's questions from all over the world, and it's a different medium. Go ahead, Bill.
Another aspect of this, though, is discoverability. Back in the early days of radio, it was a home living room phenomenon. And then when it moved to cars, everything changed because push button radio made it real easy for you to be driving to work or from work and hit one of those 5 or 6 stations that you might have been lucky enough to have in your market. Then as things change, and in the podcasting world, the biggest issue I see is that how do you find one station out of 100,000 or 200,000 or a million potential podcasters out there? Your discoverability goes to heck, literally, because it's hard to be seen and picked out of that maelstrom.
Yeah, and the one place that I think is really sensitive is like music. Like music radio to me doesn't even exist anymore. Like the idea that I would listen hoping to hear what a song that I wanted, as opposed to if I want to be exposed to new things, I'm just going to turn Pandora on. Like it's like and here's got some songs I like, and then have them play it out. The idea that I would I find that to be incredibly frustrating, is to go on, because I've got 100 playlists. And then the most valuable thing that I do is when my family does it, we pass the phone around and everybody gets to do the next song, and we've gotten really good at next song on Apple Music. And I learn more from my kids about what they're listening to by letting them, do that than I ever got from any radio station. Go ahead, Mitchell.
In the advertising world, where time buyers, people that make the decisions where they place their advertising dollars, the term reach usually refers to reach and frequency, and it's a formula that basically says I have to run this many ads on this station to reach 10% or 20% of my audience. So that's what they refer to as reach and frequency, just to put it in context.
Yeah, it means something different in Facebook, and it means it's almost worthless, in the online world. But in the broadcast world, you're absolutely correct. But in the online world, it's a kind of a worthless number. Next question.
Sarah Doyle, Falls Church, Virginia. Epiphan had their release event for their Connect service yesterday for Microsoft Teams. Anyone else catch it?
Go ahead, Grant.
I'm just catching up on it now. I could be wrong. It looks like it's a total cloud service, so no hardware tied into Teams, and another way of getting Teams participants pulled into essentially like a cloud production. And so that's cool. And we're seeing similar things. We're not here at Office Hours, we're not backwards in coming forward about how we prefer Zoom. And there's lots of reasons why we do, but there's some healthy competition. I don't want Teams to go away, because I want them to keep pushing Zoom and keep the pressure on Zoom. And so more of these services that are tying in and being able to, rather than screen scraping, ways that are able to pull things out directly is really good. And they're talking about 1080p and so yeah, it's something.
They talk about 1080p. So far okay, I just want to make sure we're clear. The 1080p in Teams, as far as I know, still as far as the infrastructure goes, as soon as you add more than one person, so you have 1, 2, you get 1080p. If you have a 1080p account, go to 3 and you're back to 720. And I believe that is still the case. And I don't think that has changed in the way Teams goes. I think that the big thing is that, so many of us were using Skype for production, and Microsoft screwed it up so badly. I mean, it's like literally one of the most epic fails ever when it comes to infrastructure, that I think it's really hard. They have a lot of, I guess I would say, social debt, not really, and some technical debt. They have technical debt in the sense that we keep on going back to 720. They have social debt in the sense that they just really threw us all into the trash can, a couple times, and we kept on getting out going, no, there's no other choice. So we'll just go back to, I know we'll get thrown in the trash can again. And Zoom has not done that. And instead they hired probably the best team in the world to work on this stuff. And so I think that's our bullishness about Zoom is probably more specific of our bullishness of liminal. Like, I just want to make sure like we're all clear. It's not really, Zoom is doing a good job, and they have the vision to pick a team that's going to make it go. But I think when it comes to broadcast, I don't see how, when you look at the new Zoom ISO 2.0, you're seeing Zoom pulling away, in as far as a production solution right now, while Teams is still kind of muddling through what they're doing. I do think Connect is showing that Microsoft is serious about continuing to move forward with this, and they're going to keep on putting engineering, and I think Zoom has to track that. But this is Zoom's game to lose, and so if they lose to Microsoft with Teams, that'll be a pretty sad thing. And to be clear, we'll move if they do. Like if Teams starts doing a better job than Zoom, then we'll start using Teams. But I'd have to see that, and I think that if I was betting, I wouldn't bet on that, but I would, we're absolutely always looking for the best broadcast solution for what we're doing, and we're pretty cutthroat about that. And the reason that we're so bullish on Zoom is because they're doing a good job. Next question.
Kenny Hampton in Greenville, Illinois. Watching a British sports commentator, I observed the use of a handheld mouth covering mic. I learned was a lip ribbon mic. Are these widely used? And why the fragile ribbon element? Who manufactures this style of mic?
Go ahead, Bill.
The company is called Coles, C-O-L-E-S, and the Coles lip mic has been around literally for decades. Used, I think, initially for things like racing when you're in a loud environment. It uses the combination of the inverse square principle, because literally there's a bar on the top of the mic that you position onto your lip. Then your mouth is perfectly suited right directly adjacent to the ribbon. The ribbon is there because it's essentially a large, robust enough diaphragm to take that sound pressure level and translate it into audio. And it really does an extraordinary job of knocking down surrounding noise and isolating the voice. They're good mics. They cost a few $100 US. They're not inexpensive, but they're a great tool if you need that kind of circumstance.
Yeah, I believe it's the Coles 4104B is the one that is usually you see there, and they're about $800 or $900 each. To use them, I find them to be a little thin. I was just watching a show, and maybe it's the same one. There was a live YouTube, the YouTube team versus another team, soccer team or whatever. Incredible. They had like 2.5 million concurrent viewers, I think, over the weekend. And so I tuned in a little bit. Big stream. You just want to see what's going on. And they were using the ribbon mics, and I really felt like they're using these Coles, and I felt like their voice sounded a bit thin. I was like, if they just used regular mics, I think they would have sounded more full. And I don't think there was any reason to do that other than someone told them to do it. I do think in high wind, in really like race car, high things, I think that these do make a difference. But I think that sometimes they're overused, because they're kind of a style. It's a little retro. Anyway,
definitely a niche microphone. It's not, you shouldn't have just that and nothing else.
Yeah. Anyway, next question.
Douglas Carmichael. We talk about how fake comms can be used, a useful technique for building audience suspense, and the disciplined nature of said comms is a major part of that. What's the secret to building tight and disciplined crews?
I think one of the things is that being clear of what you're expecting, so be clear of what you're expecting. Also, you try to have we tend to pick crews partially by how they are on the, if you're all over the place on comms, chances of me bringing you back, even if you're really good at what you do, chances of me bringing you back are pretty low. You really need to be, we have guys for some reason in Vegas, like all the camera operators talk about sports and inappropriate things, and so we try to bring our own camera operators in. Sometimes the union requires us to use them, but otherwise we spend a lot of time on the comms going, hey, let's stay focused, let's stay focused, and people who can't stay focused don't usually make it to the next show. And so, cause it's really, it can be a real, attention pull if people are talking about things that aren't part of the show on comms. It can have people thinking about the wrong things at the wrong time. when they need to be focused on what they're doing. So there's a lot of us going on, just going, let's keep it tight. Oftentimes, to your point, Douglas, we say keep it tight. Let's keep it tight means that you've just stepped into something that you don't need to talk about, and usually that's not bad. It's just usually something other than the show, on comms. And so I think that holding that line, picking people who can manage that line is a big part of it. Just remember that, I think that people need to understand that getting hired is 60-70% of how you are on the team, and about 30-40% of your skill set, and so I think people forget that a lot. They think they just have to do their job and they can be however they want to be. That's usually not the case. All right. We're now changing subjects to the Queen's funeral, and we're going to talk a little bit about the coverage. What's interesting about it is, and panelists, you can raise your hand if you have some comments and you want to talk about it. Otherwise, we'll jump right into questions. What's interesting is that this is something that BBC didn't know when it was going to happen, but they did know it was going to happen, and they did know that it was going to be a big deal. And so they've been working on this for decades, literally, because at a certain age, you just know that it's going to keep on getting closer. And so they've been working on it. They've used other events to practice ideas, to work through processes. And so we really saw, their vision of this is the way to cover this, because they may not cover it again for another couple decades, and so they're only going to do it. And of course, I think that the numbers were astounding. I don't remember what the number was, but it's in the billions of people that watched it. I mean, it was a lot of people saw at least some of it. So it's quite a thing to have some people watching it that far. And I thought a lot of the coverage, I've only been able to scan it. I was in production over the last 10 days. I've been crazy, so I only scanned it a little bit. But it's pretty impressive on how they put that together. Go ahead, Hashid.
What was fascinating to me was the percussion, and we had a question a month back that mentioned London Bridge is falling down, I think, or something of that nature, and I guess that's what they called it as far as the procession and the processes of the Queen's not going to be no longer. But really what I found really fascinating was the musicality of the drumming. They used some sort of a metronome with one of the drummers they mentioned on one of the news hits. And it was I guess they had some kind of a pad that made some sort of tone where it kept all the drummers even when they were marching down. And the camera views, some people have mentioned to me that they were incredible, but I guess it's just a couple of PTZs strung up in a long range. But I would love to hear more about that from you guys.
Yeah, go ahead, Grant.
Yeah, I was looking up some of the numbers. What's interesting to me is that it had 11 million people watched it in the US, which is a big deal given that it's not in the monarchy. And so it was just a big world event. And also all of the streaming networks and stuff. So it would be interesting for me from a business point of view as to how that the rights for all the different broadcasters and streaming networks and things, how much they were paying for that. And that if the BBC knew that they would have significant money rolling in for the rights to be able, and so they could probably throw whatever they wanted to throw at it. But as I look at it, I'm interested, and I'm sure we'll get into it more, is just camera layout and thinking of across that huge distance that they're doing, and inside the church and things like that. I'm sure we'll get to that.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
So I hadn't watched any of it. So I last night, knowing we were going to talk about this morning, asked my wife. She has been a fan kind of the British monarchy since she was a little girl. And I think it comes partially from reading all those fairy tales about the queens and the princesses and the kings and things like that. And she was very invested in Diana when she came through. She followed her journey as somebody who was pulled into that limelight, because that's also a piece of the fairy tale piece. And I asked her how she felt about it, because she actually got up in the middle of the night to watch the investiture and the actual process. And she explained a little to me the next day about what had happened. And it really, I think, profoundly moved her. And she said the thing that most impressed her about it was the director and the people who ran balanced this idea of spectacle, and there was certainly plenty of spectacle there, with focusing on individual stories across a lot of people, that you would go from the magnificence of Westminster Abbey, but then before too much of that, they would talk to somebody. Now, whether that was the commentators, she also was impressed with the amount of time they left the images to just tell the story, and they didn't do constant commentary on it. And in fact, she watched a little bit of BBC because we're subscribers to the BBC video channel. A huge swath of that had no commentary whatsoever. They literally just did natural sound and the coverage of that, knowing that their audience would understand the ritual and the meaning and all of the symbolism, so they didn't have to explain it. Now, when she was watching the U.S. coverage, there was more of that, but she said they also were very restrained and they didn't try to talk constantly. And I thought that was a really good lesson. Overall, she gave all the coverage she watched very high marks for being both appropriately somber, but also understanding that this was expected and people wanted to talk about their feelings, but also not get too maudlin about it. They wanted to celebrate the Queen's extraordinary reign and not look back at the loss as much as balance that.
Yeah, I think that they definitely don't want to treat it like a sports event. So talking over everything would be probably not the right direction to go. And I think that it was interesting. I watched it a little bit this morning getting ready for this, and I noticed that there's definitely points they knew when not to talk, and then when they were between things, they would explain a couple more things about what's happening, and then they'd go back to not talking, which I thought was really and it was obviously they very much understood it. One thing to look at when you watch that footage is how they had a camera for everything, and the thing you want to think about is the amount of logistics of, the timeline is very, very well set. It's been practiced. It's been talked about. It's been years of talking about, we're going to go to this person and then this person, and the bagpipes are going to play up here. And then this is going to go down here. And it's all like boom, 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 boom. And they figure out all those camera positions. And that is something that we do all the time. Like, we're going to have a camera for here and here and here, but this is many, many cameras and an incredible amount of coverage. And, really being able to think about it. The logistics are intense. I'm going to see if we can reach out and see if we can't find someone to talk about it. But we'll see I don't know anybody off the top of my head, but we're going to see what we can do, because I think it'd be really interesting to talk through that. Let's go to the next question.
Next one comes from Mike Beardmore, reading in the UK. And he says, BBC used a pan and tilt camera stuck under the archway between the Horseguards and Whitehall, which coped with high-res sun to darkness transitions when following the coffin. Would it be the new Sony perhaps?
Go ahead, Grant.
Yeah, so it could have been, but the reality is that pan tilt zoom cameras are used in broadcast all the time, and one of the key requirements for those is that you can shade them. So we call them CCU operators, and so they're manually controlling the iris, and they are watching that all the time, and so. I've done it a little bit on the cricket we have in Australia, and one of the hardest things is when the sun comes over and we have shadow. We have half of the field in shadow, and half in direct sun, and so you're literally you're working on a joystick at opening and closing, and you're constantly, as the ball goes into the sun, you pull them back, and as you're going into the shade, you're opening up, and and so you get these operators that do this day in, day out are very, very good at it, and depending on, clearly it's a high quality PTZ camera that has good control over the iris, and that have really good controls to be able to do that, and they might be controlling 3 or 4 different cameras at the same time, that one operator, and there would have been a lot of operators because of how many cameras there were across the event.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about that, you see that a lot in American football as well, as in an arena where there's a big shadow going through the middle of the arena and of the stadium, and you can see the cameras opening and closing. When you see that, that's not a camera operator doing that. That's someone on RCP, remote control paint box, and so you can, you'll see them kind of working through that, and it's a really problematic thing to do. HDR makes it a little easier because it can actually absorb all of that. So if you see the raw HDR feed, sometimes You'll notice that they do a lot less of that because they don't have to, because there's actually enough data to manage a lot of those, not all of it, but a lot of it, and it's a lot easier. I don't think that they're using the Sony one because the Sony one's not in production yet. So they announced it. They've got a couple units laying around, but they're not producing those in any kind of other than the pre-production units. They don't have any. I don't think any of them are going into out of the factory until November. So that's probably unlikely that's happening. I only know because I'm really interested in getting one. So anyway, so I've paid a lot of attention tracking it closely. So I think that typically these would be using something like, I don't know what brands they were using, but they would typically take a full-sized broadcast camera and they would hang it on what's called a telemetrics head. So telemetrics is probably the leader in this. Panasonic makes remote heads, Canon makes remote heads, but the ones that we see the most in production are telemetrics heads, and you can literally just hang them upside down, and you just have to orient the camera so that you can to do that. But these are arms, and they have a piece that the camera hangs on, and we use them a lot for stage events. So very large stage presentations where they're going to show the next Android device or whatever, or the next computer, and they want that overhead, that over shoulder shot, but out of frame. Well, if you look up at a big like Google event or something like that, you're going to see 3 to 6 of these cameras that are all literally hanging from the truss. And you have to be very careful about how you set them up, because a lot of times they are just hanging. And so then you have weight issues and you have to stabilize them and a bunch of other things, but they hang there. My guess is that for most of these, they were using some pretty high quality cameras. If you're going to capture this, I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't some of the cameras trying to capture at 8K, so that might be a Venice or it might be some other things like that. But they definitely are shooting at least 4K, and they're going to want the largest chips and everything else. You only get to do this once, and so I imagine that a lot of the stuff, and I thought that the image quality on almost everything I saw was pretty astounding. Like it was like there was definitely a spared no expense feel to what they were doing there. So I wouldn't be surprised if there weren't, more than just regular broadcast cameras capturing the thing that you're not going to get to do ever again. And the first one in 70 years, so I think that it was a pretty interesting thing to see. Next question.
Next question comes to us from Vincent Alvarez in Bellingham, Washington. At the end of the funeral, the Queen was dramatically lowered into the floor of the cathedral. I couldn't find info on how they did that, and did they wait until everyone left to retrieve the lift and then lower her down once again? Just curious.
I don't know. I don't have that answer. Yeah, go ahead, Grant.
Yeah, I would be really sure that the process that they're following does not include behind the scenes pulling the coffin back out and putting it back down again. Everything that they're doing is meticulously planned out and is part of the process. It's not a show. It is actually the thing. And so I couldn't find it as I was looking, but I in some of these burials that I've seen, there's some really cool ways of doing it with slings, and so it actually sits on a sling. It's lowered, it lowers into the ground, and then the sling is able to be pulled out, from one side to another, and all of that could be done in a way that's sort of hidden away. And so that sling mechanism and the way of it, not hydraulically, but in a controlled way, can lower. And then the sling can be pulled out and the whole thing. So there's ways of doing it.
Yeah. Next question.
Next one comes to us from Simon Ray in Shrewsbury in the UK. How many extra camera angles would you plan for in order to cover up or gloss over issues in highly visible areas like the hymn sheet falling to the floor?
Go ahead, Grant.
So general observations about the angles that they had, lots. I sort of lost count as I was looking around in the church. Couple of things. One was that you can't see the cameras really easily, so they were hidden away really nicely. Often in some of these events, you might have big camera risers in the middle, to get the good shots. You're not seeing camera risers in these. But here's a really interesting observation about this, and that is that Westminster Abbey is part of the talent of the show. It is the architecture of that beautiful building it's not equal to, but it is part of what you are experiencing. And so there are many, many wide angle shots. There's a really, really wide angle shot right from the ceiling. So because of the shape of the church and where where all of the audience are, is in that cross shape. And so having that really wide shot, I saw that I was trying to work that out because it zoomed in a couple of times, but I didn't see it move. I think it would have been a pan tilt zoom with a nice, I was going to say it's a really wide angle lens. I guess at that point it's so high that it didn't need to be all that wide.
Right.
But it did zoom in a couple of times. But my point to that is that they did lots of wide angle shots. And so your question around things that are happening, a hymn sheet dropping or something that's happening that they want to cut away to, there's many, many safety shots they had, those really wide shots that they could cut to that gave you context, but took you away from being distracted by something that was happening in the immediate or the micro. So it was really nicely cut, going from close up, tight close up shots, to constantly coming back to remember what building we're in. Remember this beautiful building.
You good, Bill?
Yeah, there is an advantage. Great Britain, England particularly, has been an economic powerhouse for huge amounts of time across the world, and they've invested a lot in these beautiful structures, and we see them all over the world. And when you have that kind of place like Westminster Abbey, and I was lucky enough to get to visit it once when I was younger, it is a character, I think, and there's an expectation. We've seen these things, the Houses of Parliament, the Windsor Castle. They are something that it's a talisman that I think people really do want to have be a part of this continuation of the pageant of the story of England that we've all grown up with.
Next question.
Vincent Alvarez in Bellingham, Washington. During the outside procession, there was a man who yelled at Prince Andrew about his prior accusations. He was swiftly taken away. What happens to people like him? Taken to the Tower of London? Just a ticket?
Go ahead, Grant.
I don't know what happened to him, but the point was he's being pulled away. The interesting thing is obviously security was huge at that point, and the security will be following the procession as well as far as the key part of it. The other thing I think of is that not only do you have security against someone who's trying to do that, you've got millions of people that are all standing around that are also against you doing that. And so there's civilians that are jumping in and sorting people out with that too.
I think he got dropped off at a small sheep farm in an island off the coast of Scotland. It's just like, here, you can try to find your way home, and so anyway, the interesting thing about that a lot of times is the things that, obviously we try to, this is a very high profile event. There's a lot of concerns about what could possibly happen. And so, the things that are added to all of these things are, you have sharpshooters almost all the way down the procession. You've got plainclothes, so you have people that just look like they got sweatshirts and everything else on. Probably for a procession like this, probably every 100 feet at minimum, they're there. Then you have the police. Then you have more operatives that you're going to see with more visible earpieces and so on and so forth that are still plainclothes, but definitely part of you'll have these kinds of things have an incredible amount of security involved to have them actually happen. I don't know whether the entire procession was protected that much, but I would imagine that there was metal detectors, and what they do is they kind of slowly, in the United States, especially if the heads of state are going to be there. So because Biden was there at one point, when heads of state start to show up, what happens is, and that to some degree belongs, it's a coordination between our Secret Service and their security. But usually what happens is that they start tightening the location. And so the way they do that is they start to near the center, but not in an organized way so that you can't figure out exactly what they're going to do. They won't talk about it a lot, but they'll just start closing sections off, and they start putting up these fences to control space. And so they start closing one section off. And again, it's a little bit unpredictable. It's not unpredictable for them, but it's not in like a circular fashion. But they have a pattern that they're using. And they slowly build. What they're doing basically is slowly building a sterile space. So in the spaces that they close off, that's bomb sniffing dogs, usually specific individuals within the military, as well as our intelligence agencies going through it. So all of that stuff happens in section by section by section as they slowly close that off. And so what you can get to starts to become less and less and less until it's completely closed off. And that takes sometimes hours, sometimes all night, for them to kind of close that all off. And then at that point, they know they have a specific number of locations that they have to secure, and they're able to kind of slowly tighten that process up. So anyway, so those are that's kind of how they tighten those things up. So getting through that, it just means that you probably don't have anything that you can threaten people with, but you still have your voice, which he showed that he had. So you can still yell things out if you'd like. And again, you'll usually not last very long. And in addition to those, a lot of times there's volunteers that are part of the procession. The volunteers provide a buffer. So they're connected to the organization putting it up. They provide typically a buffer between the security personnel and the people, and they're kind of the soft part of that. They can identify something very quickly. They can help try to move people forward. Once someone from the security team shows up, they're usually a little bit more assertive, and so that, a lot of times that those volunteers provide a buffer that keeps the security team from having to interact with everybody directly. There's soft ways of kind of moving people out of the way. I didn't see his specifically. If he went down very quickly, then he was not dealing with that buffer. He was dealing with a security detail. Go ahead, Bill.
Another one of the logistics. We talk about logistics a lot, and I just realized how long this procession route was. And I noticed that they were using what we call here in the U.S. bicycle fence. I don't know if it's simple, but they had a whole array. And I just saw this huge long shot, and I went, my gosh, how many sections of that did they have to order for the two sides of this to give the crowd? I don't think it's actually somebody could hop over that, but I don't think this crowd would have. I think they were being polite, but it gave them a stop place that was even. So even on the long shots, they weren't ragged edges. They were precise and beautiful. And so there must be a warehouse somewhere with literally tens of thousands of these physical barriers that you could bring out for a huge event like that. That's just part of the logistics of scale to an event of this magnitude.
Oh yeah, I mean, like you go to we've streamed the political conventions, and there'll be like miles of these barricades that are designed. And the way that they're designed is they're kind of loosely connected to each other. They're not brittle. They're usually connected. So if you ran a car into them, they'll just kind of pull like a fence line that gets real heavy real quick. They're not going to handle, you're not going to be able to break through them very, very easily. And again, the other thing to think about here is when someone starts to make noise, one of the reasons that there's, people can say, oh, it's suppression of free speech and everything else. A typical behavior of a terrorist organization is to create a distraction and then do something else somewhere else when everyone's looking one direction. And so typically if you're in what we would consider a high secure area and you start doing something that's an anomaly, you'll get taken out really fast. You're not taken out, but you'll be removed very quickly because they're trying to remove any distraction from a potential kinetic operation. So they're just not going to put up with a lot of that because it puts everybody in danger. Next question.
John Snyder in Reno, Nevada is up next. How do you plan differently when you know what you want to do, but not when it will happen?
Go ahead, Grant.
I think it's pretty similar. I would expect that there was teams and teams of people that just are working on this. They're constantly refining it. They're meeting even when it was obviously when it was coming more imminent. But the plan is the same. It just then becomes about the personnel. But you would be putting all sorts of people on standby, and you'd be saying, "At someday we're going to be calling on you to do this and this, and so now let's plan it as if it's happening tomorrow. What are you going to do?" And working all through that. I know this is a completely different scale, but I was talking about cricket before. our cricket test matches go for 5 days, but sometimes they might finish in 3 days. Sometimes they finish in 2 days, rarely, but
crazy.
So yeah.
Crazy sport.
So we have a whole production team. We'll have teams, production crews of 60 people, right? And we're in another city and we're planning for 5 days of cricket. And at the, halfway through the third day, we might be saying, do you know what? I think this game's going to finish up and we're now loading out on the third day instead of the fifth day. There's so much that changes, but it's just an example of you have all these plans in place and then you execute it. And I don't think that at the BBC they had a folder that said Queen's funeral and they dust it off and go, all right, here we go.
Yeah.
They've been working on this for years. There's probably people that are dedicated to it and they're constantly refining all of it. And now it's like, okay, here's the call, everyone. It's happening. And here's the clear run, way of executing it all. And now they're just putting in the specific names of the people that are filling in all those jobs.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I was going to say a little bit of a parallel. It's not entirely, because this was one of the largest scale operations that's ever taken place, I think, on the planet. The hurricane that's threatening Florida was interesting. There was one of the public safety local officials who was talking on camera today, and he said, normally we run 3 shifts in all of our fire stations and things like that because we need to staff it 24 hours a day. I can assure you that every single personnel is now sleeping in the firehouses getting ready for this event to happen so that we are maximally staffed the next morning when we have to go out there and take care of so much damage. There's got to be a piece of this where I'm sure that after waiting for 30, 40, 50, 60 years and going through these things, it was a complete all hands on deck. Every potential personnel that could contribute to this was undoubtedly called in and was ready for it when their call time was.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things you can do ahead of time. So one of the things, if we know we're going to work at locations, like one of the things I have now is I finally bought a LiDAR scanner. And when I'm at a location, any location that I go to, I just go, hey, can I take a couple pictures? Now, what I mean by taking a couple pictures is I'm going to take a LiDAR. Like, and it's just, it just shoots 360 images with depth. It's too hard to explain what it is. And so I just walk around the facility and absorb lots of data of that facility, even if I don't know if I'm going to come back, because I almost always come back to a facility. In this case, they had total access to all the locations that they're going to do. So my guess is that there were pretty detailed scans of the whole location. There already are of most of those locations. That there are SketchUp models or other types of the SketchUp is just a generalization of 3D models that they're using to put things in. They can previs most of these things at this point. They can be talking about them. Any other event that happens in these locations can be used as a prep. So there's been other funerals recently. So those are all opportunities to check camera angles. I'm sure that there were days where they put those cameras in, take a look at them, see how they're working. This is all part of a pre-pro that probably lasted decades. And so they know where those places are that they want to, based on experience as well as testing. And you'll test things over months or years to know, okay, these are the angles that we want. This is how we're going to look at it. This is what we're going to do here. And then you have a director come in and make the decision about how they're going to do that. But yes, I think that they probably had a team that was working on this full time, and that's what they do. And they probably, if it was me, I don't know what they did. That team would be on the cruise for every other major event that they have, writing things down like, oh, we should do that. Like that's and they're constantly going to IBC or NAB looking for things from that filter, the filter of how do I do this thing, right? And what are the comms that we need? What are all the PLs and what are all the directs and how many, different things, and where will wireless work and how will it, like all these things. And I would be very surprised if they didn't have a relatively robust team that is constantly working on something that might happen. And there's a lot of things in government where there's a lot of people that just rehearse over and over and over for something, and they might rehearse over and over and over for their whole life, and never actually do it. But when did Noah build the ark? Before the rain. so you always want to be kind of working through those solutions. But we do that all the time as well with our productions, is that we think of things like, oh, in another production, we're going to need to do this, or this is going to be a problem. And that's where, all kinds of postmortems and so on and so forth make sense for us to constantly figure out what would we do. And then I bet you that person comes in and asks questions from that, again, from the filter of we're going to do this in the future. They're asking questions of the team, like what worked, what didn't work, and why did we do this and why did we do that, to try to keep on tightening that solution up. And it must have been quite a rush for them to suddenly have to put it into place, and put it. But again, planning for decades, for something that they just would only have a couple of days to sort out. Next question.
Robert Soji in Los Angeles asks, do any of the panelists know the details of the audio production? The sound quality was impressive.
No, we're going to see if we can get some people on. I'll start kicking it around. I'd be really interested to find out what that is, but it was every part of this, I scanned through it. Again, last week was pretty busy for me, so I wasn't able to dig into it, and every part of it was pretty impressive. Next question.
Dave Burke in Alexandria, Virginia. I've been looking for a good article about the logistics and execution of the overall event. Has anyone come across good coverage of that angle? One question I had while watching was just how did they get all participant people where they need to be?
I don't know how they did it, but I can tell you that generally there's a pretty detailed plan of how they do it. A lot of it has to do with people. So you think that there's just a bunch of signs, people go there, but a lot of times on something much smaller than this, you might have hundreds of people that are being paid to move people from one place to the other, to tell them where to go, to answer their questions. Even in a small event, much smaller event that might only have tens or hundreds of thousands of people, having those relays of people that are all on comms, that are all talking to each other, they are a soft security, but a lot of what they're doing is just making sure that the flow of participants works out. And then, of course, you have who has access to where, and that's usually bracelets and badges and all kinds of other things. And then people just knowing who you are. The buttons, popular to have little buttons that only you can have. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, and also remember, this was an official state event in a sovereign state, which means that unlike those of us who put on things where we hire off-duty official police or something like that to handle traffic, they had links into and command of the entire British logistical support. So anything they needed to do in terms of closing off anything, I'm sure they had ample ways to get that accomplished.
I have to admit, I did watch it a little bit. And what came up for me was I really would love to talk to the frequency coordinator for this event. Frequency coordinator, for those listening, are the person who manages all the wireless connections. So you check in with them. These are the wireless connections these are the wireless frequencies I'm going to use for this thing. And they go, oh, no. The BBC has these ones. And, the Americans have this one. And Secret Service has these. And, well, they won't tell you which. They just say you can't use these. So anyway, they'll tell you what you can use in that site. And they're trying to keep everybody separate. And this and conventions, like political conventions, tend to be super complex, things where there's just so many people trying to use wireless at the same time that you really, and then there'll be little, again, the YouTubers and podcasters and stuff show up and with their ENG 100s, little Sennheisers stepping all over each other. And the frequency coordinators, oftentimes, I was talking to one of them and he goes, oh yeah, we just don't let anybody else use the frequencies that are commonly part of the Sennheisers, because the Sennheisers are really well known. And we just let them oftentimes just let them live over in this little world, and come over and talk to them if they get outside of the frequencies, the default frequency. They said it's just generally the problem really is that everybody has defaults that they just leave their frequencies on. Next question.
Graham Cardwell in Belfast, Northern Ireland. I know that in some of the coverage, for example, the coffin removal from Scotland to London, several news organizations pooled and shared their footage, BBC, Sky, ITV, and so forth. How common is that elsewhere?
Go ahead, Grant.
Yeah, so I'm talking about cricket a bit, and it's probably because it's an English game, it relates. And so one of the things is that we have what we call a world feed, and so there's when we're broadcasting, sometimes we'll have two broadcast trucks for the cricket, and there'll be and all shared cameras, and then maybe a handful of extra cameras for more local. And so there'll be a world feed that's going on, and that's the main mixed mixed feed that comes in, and then the local broadcaster will have their own handful of cameras that they've got for doing talent on the field, or a couple of extra shots that they might have, a studio, and then a safety shot that they can cut to, and then they'll have the main program feed, like a clean feed that's coming in from the broadcaster, and also a couple of, they might have direct feeds, a couple of ISO feeds from them as well. Now that's what's happening on site. In this example, I think you're talking probably about some things that was probably time shifted. It wasn't necessarily always live, and so they were pulling those feeds together. I think that the BBC would be saying, here is the official feed, and so, and then they would be cutting that up and using that. And so this kind of relates to Dave's question as well, which is the same thing about the different feeds. Sorry, Craig's question, and that same thing. So I think that when it was being streamed, when it was being broadcasted out, the BBC would be pushing out the world feed, and probably giving people some ISO feeds as well. And so what that means is that then if people are doing their own coverage, they can have their own voiceovers and commentary that's happening in the different languages. And if they're talking about a particular thing that's not what is on the main world feed at the time, then they can cut to that. And so they start to create a little bit of their own broadcast. But probably 90% of it is the BBC feed that's coming through.
Yeah, Bill?
Also, I didn't realize it kind of, when I heard the word Commonwealth again, I stopped for a minute and I thought about, oh yeah, that is a different kind of a form. I mean, in the United States, we have separate states entities. In the Commonwealth, there are a number of people who are members, Britain had an empire for a huge chunk of history. So I was surprised when they said, well, why is the seating chart the way it is, and why is Barbados ahead of the United States? And the answer was in part, well, they're part of the Commonwealth.
Right.
It's exactly like they might be a state in the U.S., and somebody else who isn't a state doesn't go ahead of a state. And so it's interesting that coverage is all part of the Commonwealth, so I can see them sharing a lot, probably personnel as well as equipment and things.
I'd be really interested to know whether, it might be something that in that process, the Commonwealth, each member of the Commonwealth might have had access to certain cameras that would allow them to get their folks, on that nobody else necessarily needs to see, but they want to make sure they're able to cover it. It would be fascinating to find out. Yeah, but what we oftentimes call these also in the United States are pool feeds. So the pool feed is just basically one organization, everyone chips in and one organization provides all the cameras. Then part of the problem with that is part of the problem with not doing that is that you have to duplicate a lot of cameras, because when you're cutting the show, if you have more than one director, how do you tell a camera to be in two places at one time? Or as soon as a camera operator's off, usually they're hunting for something else to hand you as a director. They're looking for giving you the next right footage. They might catch a close up and the director's like, no, I don't want that. Or they'll zoom in, focus, and zoom back out to make sure that they're in focus, and so on and so forth. And all that's happening between whoever is calling the show. And so as a result, it's very hard for you to just give everybody multiple directors. So usually the pool feed, and otherwise you'd have to have tons of cameras all in the same places, which would be silly. So what happens is we build a pool feed, and that's going to be the main draw out. And a lot of times the ISOs are things that are wide cameras that the operator knows that they're always potentially live. And so they're designed like they're going to follow the procession, but they're not going to refocus or anything else. Everything's slow movement, everything's moving around. They know that they're potentially on all the time, and no one's calling it, but they're then providing those back out as ISOs that people can grab onto. So those are kind of how that gets sometimes, shaken into a full feed. These can get very complex. If you look at FIFA or you look at the Olympics, you're seeing the same thing with multiple pool feeds that are being provided, and then people are adding their own commentary. And this is also where you hear the term sometimes, the upstream keys and the downstream keys. This is what's really important, is these downstream keys, because it means the main feed might have its own. They're planning to do some graphics and so on and so forth, but they don't want to send those graphics, the lower thirds, everything else out to everyone. So they're going to add what they need over it, but they're going to have what we call a clean feed that's going to go out. What Grant was referring to earlier is as a clean feed going out to everyone so that they can have that. They can put their own graphics over top of it and do their own commentary. It is. I've sat through a couple breakdowns of like FIFA from Brazil, and it was just mind numbing. It's because it's like 192 vendors that are pulling different versions of this out and then streaming it to them. And sometimes it's all going to the cloud and getting pulled back down. It's pretty interesting. Next question.
Craig McFarland in Boston, Massachusetts. I noticed many networks had slightly different camera feeds. Were those from their own cameras or just multiple feeds to choose from?
I think Grant covered that a little bit. Generally, it could be a mixture of both, depending on what their leverage is. I mean, not everybody gets to say, "Hey, I'd like to put my own camera in." so they might be like, "Well, we already have one there. We'll give it to you, or we won't." So it just depends on where you are in the food chain. Next question.
Dave Troutman in Edmonton, Canada. I didn't see a lot of helicopter shots, perhaps the odd drone. Does this contrast with how the U.S. might cover a state funeral?
Go ahead, Grant.
I think this is all about sound. And it is not just sound, but distraction. This is the highest of pomp and circumstance that you can have, and it is. And so they need it to be really quiet. And so I think some drone shots, some drones here and there, especially the little ones. I was playing around with one of the DJI Mini 3s. So quiet. Quiet, and you can get an amazing shot out of that. And I could barely hear it, and I could just see it. And so there's some drones that you get some decent shots. Otherwise, they would do old school big, what we call cherry pickers, which is those the big platforms that they'd do it old school like that and not do helicopter shots.
There you go, Bill.
Also, I can't imagine a more tightly controlled airspace anywhere on the planet than that area of the world during the Queen's coronation. I mean, there's so many heads of state and so much that they would have locked everything down, and you had to be the most insider of the insider to be allowed to send anything up in the air during the course of that procession.
Go ahead, Rashid.
I was listening to a podcast recently, and the person that lived in UK mentioned that they had the 2 minutes of silence where even airlines and everything else flights were canceled. So definitely an audio thing for getting better shots. But as far as the audio, it's really good.
I had a show that was starting right during the 2 minutes of silence, or 1 minute of silence, I think it was. It was 8:00 in the UK, and there was a moment of silence last week, and we had we delayed our show. It was a live show to an event it was simulcast in the United States as well as in the UK, and there was a meeting about it. like we have to delay that so that everyone can do what they're doing there, and then we'll start back up again. Last question for the first hour.
Paul Shadwell, Termenthal, Switzerland. For those interested, this is the description of what happens after the coffin is lowered, and he has a link there. So,
Grant, are you able to give us a little bit of a highlight of that for people listening?
I was just going to say I stand corrected, and that is that there was a lift. There's actually a design of that. So there was a lift, and then of course I didn't think of this. The body is laid to rest with her parents, and so there's a whole process, and so that is obviously in a whole other place. And so so it could have just been a simple lift that went down, and then there was another procedure that happened that went through. And I guess the point is that I'm sure that was also a highly orchestrated process that would have gone through, and there would have been people that were observing that as well. That whole process. So, but yes, I stand corrected. It's important when we're talking about different questions and people have different opinions. We say what we think we might know, and we can be wrong. And so
it's great.
Hey, I just noticed in panel chat, Peter Sargent put the restriction of flying regulations for London for that period of time. So if you're interested in that, you can go through and read those.
That's good. It's good. Good little discussion about events. I think there's usually a lot of similarities. It's not just the Queen's funeral, but really just how these big events get done. And I'm sure we'll have opportunities to cover more of those in the future.
Yeah, if we can get someone like as you said about the frequency coordinator, you're just like we'd do a total second hour on just frequency coordination. That would be amazing.
Somebody I think I can probably talk to about that. And I'll see if I can find like someone who's worked on the conventions as frequency coordinator would be really good in the U.S. because it's just chaos.
the more specific we get, I think the better. Like it doesn't have to be a director or the executive producer, but just the people that are making it happen.
We could do a series like every and people be like, oh, but we'd cover the different things. Or maybe during a week you're covering audio on Tuesday and then some of the graphics on Wednesday and then the video on Thursday. It'd be a lot of fun. So we'll think about how to do those kinds of things.
You should probably track down whoever was this frequency coordinator for NAB, because there's so many wireless vendors and things like that. I imagine that was a crazy time.
Yeah, I think in the U.S., my experience has been the craziest ones are the conventions, because it's really a lot of news organizations. But I actually think I know someone there, so I'll see if I can work on that.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. All right. Great work for everyone. The producers keeping us going with those questions. We slowed down a little bit, and we thought we'd just kind of meander through. we had less questions. So as a lesson for the producers, if we get not enough questions to get through the first hour, I've decided to just slow it down, and we'll just kind of work through them. So it depends, the velocity, how we do it. And you may like that we go slower, so then just ask less questions. But if you ask more questions, we'll go faster. But I thought that the conversation went really well. A lot of great questions about the second hour. I wasn't sure how well it would go. And it went well. So well done.
Alex, can I note that the just verbally that the Friday final cut thing is not going to happen this week, like many of the shows. It's been pushed back a week.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And not on Friday. And I think Elle is out this week as well. But I do believe Ken Jordan will be with us today to discuss web design after the top of the hour here. And then also thank you to the panelists. Can't do this without you. It's good to have you here. We had a great conversation. It's good to have some new faces or faces that aren't here all the time. So it's good to have, and everyone else that was here regularly as well. So thanks to the panel for doing that, and of course thanks to the great team on the back end that makes this all happen, puts it all together, and has us actually have a show. So we really appreciate all of you there. All right, let's go ahead and jump into After Hours. Now I need to go back and watch it more. I only watched a little bit of it this morning because I've been in so many productions, but
they really did a beautiful job. I couldn't find very many flaws in anything. Other parts I watched.
Grant's just laughing.
It's when you whisper and you're serious. It takes another. Bill, you being serious and whispering. It was so beautiful. It was so beautiful.
Now led to the chaos, speaking in Spanish. So I'm gonna decir algo más silencioso, entonces, para que esto sea más confuso para todos los demás.
Awesome. That's great. I have to admit, my dog cracked the door seal and came in the last. I thought, oh God, don't bark.
This is a quiet space, Bill. You got it.
Oh, that's right. Sorry.
Yeah, there you go. There we go. Okay, now.
Silencio, Bill. Más suavecito. Habla más bajo, Bill. Y va a ponerte legs.